Okay, Erev Tov everybody. Bruchim Habayim. First of all, to our two speakers tonight, Professor Elliott Malamet and Professor William Kolbrener. This is a little different from what we normally do when we have an official hartza'ah, an official lecture. This is going to be a debate, a vikuach, a discussion. We'll see how things work out. I'm very excited about it. I want to thank Avital, Rabbi, Al Hakol. Friends, just a word about Pesach, hopefully in relationship to what the professors are going to say. You know, it's very interesting that in the kashrut laws, in any law related to food, there is never a discussion about how to prepare that food. Once it is kosher, kasher, you can do whatever you like to do. There's one exception, that's Pesach, the Korban Pesach. Because in the Korban Pesach it says in the Torah, you all know, that under no circumstances, and the Torah is quite strict about it, it keeps on repeating itself a few times, telling us you are not allowed to boil or to cook the Korban Pesach, but you have to roast it. You have to roast it. And God forbid, chas v'shalom, if you boil it and you eat it that way. And the big question is, why? What is there about cooking which is wrong, and what is right about roasting? So the Maharal, in his famous commentary on the Haggadah, he says something very fascinating. He says there is a tremendous difference between the meaning of cooking and the meaning of roasting. And it relates directly to the issue and the whole meaning of Pesach. When you cook something, when you boil something, you assimilate. What you do is you bring things into the object which you want to boil or to cook. You put into the pot different vegetables, water, also spices, and what you hope will happen is that slowly the meat will pick up that aroma, it will become part of the chicken, and in that way you have added a lot of stuff coming from outside towards the object itself. Roasting, says the Maharal, is exactly the reverse. It throws everything out. Roasting does away with the blood. Anything which is not really belonging to the meat itself is removed. And that's the difference between Pesach and the Osir Moadim, the Osir festivals. What is the meaning of roasting something? Roasting means to say you do not allow any kind of assimilation to get into the object you want to prepare. When Am Yisrael, when Klal Yisrael stands at its very beginning, when it has to build itself, which is the Chag Pesach, the day on which we become a nation, where the Jewish tradition basically starts, let's say, what you can do then and what you must do then is to make sure that the stuff itself on which you want to build that tradition is strong. It is holding out. It does not yet allow anything from outside to come in. It must stand on its own with its own feet in the ground, so that later on, when you would like to assimilate matters, you can only do that after you know where you are and what you stand for. First, there must be a yesod. First, things must be clear. First, you have to know exactly what this Jewish tradition is all about. That's Pesach. Then afterwards, throughout the rest of the year, once you know who you are, what the Jewish tradition is all about, then you can pick up a lot of things around you, which perhaps are not Jewish from an original perspective, but you can use them. You can boil them, you can cook them, you can bring them into that tradition. But you can't do that if you do not know your fundamentals. If you do not know what the yesodot are, the very principles and the very depths of that Jewish tradition is all about. Says the Maharal, for that very reason, the Korban Pesach, which introduces the whole world of Pesach must be roasted. Nothing from outside. No assimilation. Nothing is coming in at this moment. We'll speak about it later on, because the truth about it is that this is not a healthy approach. Just to stand on your own and not allow anything from outside to come in, and by building big walls around you, that's ultimately not going to work. But it must work at the very beginning. It must lay the yesodot, the foundations of the Jewish tradition. It is not ideal. Pesach is not an ideal situation. Pesach is a situation where you give it a start, and the start has to be strong, overwhelming. It must be able to stand up against anything from outside, but afterwards, when you want to bring things from outside, bring them in. Once you know who you are, what you stand for, everything is fine. So therefore, it is the only time is in the Torah. There's one korban about the Nazir, which I perhaps another time will speak about, where there is a need to cook something very interesting. For the rest, as far as I know, there's no mentioning about how to prepare your food, except in this case because it needs to make a very strong point. Now you may ask me, what has this to do with these two professors over here? I'll tell you what I think. I don't know if they know this, but I do know this. They want to speak about rock and roll. That's what it says over there, right? That's the title they gave me.
Drugs also.
And about drugs. Yes. Now, I am not an expert in drugs, but I have some knowledge about rock and roll. So let's speak about that. In 1900, for those who have not learned Torah in derech eretz, I'm able to give some of my knowledge away now and show off. In the 50s, Bill Harley and the Comets were the first people who started rock and roll.
This is like the Pesach of...
You're getting there. Later on, much more known to me were the Beatles, because the Beatles were in Europe. I remember when the Beatles came out at the time, my parents and everybody else, all our parents, were terribly upset with this music. It was so wild. If I now listen to it, it sounds like Johann Sebastian Bach. It is so old-fashioned, you know, it's beautiful actually, and I still listen to it. Then you got all sorts of different kinds of rock and rolls, hard, soft, whatever it was, punk. There were all sorts of different kinds of it. And one man, a Jew, stood out and made rock and roll into a much more classic condition. I give you his Jewish name and you tell me who it is. He was called Robert Allen Zimmerman. Who is that? Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan made rock and roll into something very special with his beautiful lyrics, with his fantastic music. And there have been a few other people who were Jewish who were in this field. As far as I know, Elvis Presley was not Jewish. Also, you never know what actually is the story over there.
He was the Shabbos guy.
He was the Shabbos guy. Okay, whatever it is. Anyway, my point here obviously is the following. On Pesach, you can't play rock and roll. Why? Because it is assimilation. It comes from outside in. You have to play real Jewish music. What that is, I don't know, because I think all Jewish music is a form of assimilation, one way or the other. The Portuguese Spanish synagogue in Amsterdam and in London and in New York, they maintain that their songs are the real ones which came from the Beit HaMikdash, which, by the way, sound very similar to what the Catholic Church thinks. The songs, the melodies, are very similar. It may be that indeed there is some truth to that. I do not know, and I'm biased because I'm from the Portuguese Spanish background. But anyway, what I want to say is the following. The question indeed is, where do we bring things in from outside, and where do we stay ourselves? Where is it Pesach, and let's say where is it Shavuot? Where is it the rest of the year? I think that's a very important question. Are we able to bring anything from outside inside? Franz Rosenzweig, one of the great Jewish philosophers of the last century, the century before, used indeed to say we should not reject everything, but we should bring it into the Jewish tradition, recreate it so that it becomes part of the Jewish tradition. My question to the professors is, can we do this with rock and roll, and can we do this with use of drugs? there is a lot to be said about that, but I leave that to them.
So thank Rabbi Cardozo for inviting us here. You know, Bill and I have been friends for some years, and we have certain similarities, I guess, that brought us together and began a series of like ongoing, endless conversations between us. We're both professors of English literature. We're both Bali Tshuvah. We're both, you know, we both love rock music and art and other things, and we're sort of all of our conversations are really variations of the same theme, which is really what is the good life and how should one live and so on. So we came up with this idea of like talking together, and we started, first time out was a few months ago at Limud in the UK, where we carried out this session, and we're sort of refining it as we go along. So we don't really know what we're going to say, so we're going to give it a shot. So let's start with the origins, Bill. You know, when you were younger, Jeff Goldberg said to you that Orthodox Judaism appears like a closed-minded place away from which anybody, you know, with broad and varied interests would just flee, would run away from. And, you know, you responded that you were one of those Jews who was running away, who was fleeing. So how'd you get from that to halakhically observant Jew? What did you mean when you said you were fleeing?
You know, I remember when I was at Columbia as an undergraduate, and there was a college walk on 116th Street, I guess, right? And the Chabad had a mitzvah tank. And I'm really not, at this moment, associated in any way with their theology or their metaphysics or their hashkafa or anything like that. But I just remember the presence of the mitzvah tank on 116th Street. And when I said to Jeff Goldberg in that interview that later appeared in The Atlantic that I fled from it, I just felt that this kind of public display of this religiosity and this very strong kind of kiruv, even then, I mean, I felt it very strongly, that this kind of kiruv, and again, I know I'm not speaking globally about Chabad, but the kiruv that they were doing then and how they were relating to me was something that really alienated me, really kind of turned me off. So what was the next?
That was the running away.
Yeah, that was really the fleeing part. Oh,
right. So how do we find you?
Well, you know, I just think, you know, telling stories is it's something we have to do, and I think we have to always kind of tell stories and tell stories over again. And you know, the story of Avra Avinu's Tshuvah is not reported in the Torah because everybody's Tshuvah is so different. And even I think everybody relates, as some of you here might also have stories of becoming Bali Tshuvah, I don't know. But the way one tells that story, I think, always varies. I mean, because there are lots of ways one can report on one's life. And I think especially, and I think this is maybe what we'll talk a little bit more about, is being a Bal Tshuvah means maybe always retelling that story and remaking that story, and stories which seem very vibrant and alive and resonant and were really resources for life at some point, maybe aren't so much at another point. Right. I think that one of the stories that I might tell is that, you know, my tshuva happened really through Christianity, which is a strange way of telling a story. Meaning, I was a graduate student at Columbia, and I was studying 17th century literature. And anybody who knows just a little bit about the period of the Renaissance or the early modern period knows that it overlaps with Reformation. So it was a period of a conflict. I'm really simplifying things here. I hope there are no real historians here. It was a period of conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and I thought to myself, you know, the Catholics have this culture of tradition and community and a kind of cultural cohesiveness and cohesion. And Protestants have this strong emphasis on individual autonomy and freedom and choice. And again, I'm telling the story as I maybe would have told it 10 years ago, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a tradition that combined both of those things? And as it turned out, I found, you know, my own tradition. And in some sense, I think the Jewish tradition really does do those things, is it obviously emphasizes that sense of tradition and continuity and community, and also that sense of individual autonomy. I mean, my personal journey to Judaism was, I think, much more cognitive and much less experiential. I know Rav Soloveitchik makes that distinction. I mean, some people are really drawn into Judaism because they want to have potato kugel on Shabbos. And my mother was a good cook, so, you know, I didn't really need that. But I think your story was also kind of similar, no? Or
I mean, I'm thinking it's no wonder we're screwed up because we don't know whether we're Catholic or Protestant.
Right,
So
well. or what kind of Jews we are. I think I finally realized, I'm struggling with how to define myself. What kind of Orthodox I am, and I think I've determined that I'm a Miltonic Orthodox Jew, right? John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, meaning I'm a Protestant, I think, at heart. So.
It's a very large group, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very well. A critic said of Milton that he was a Protestant church of one, a sect unto himself.
Yeah, right,
so
exactly.
I think of myself more or less in those lines.
I didn't think about this story for years, really.
Yeah.
Like I didn't think about being a Baal Tshuvah really for a long time. I just, I became observant, and then I was interested in Judaism itself, and I wasn't interested so much in this kind of obsessive self-reflection on, who I was and where I came from and so on. And it's interesting, as I got older, quite a bit older, it started to seep back in. It's like almost Freudian uncanny. It just came back. I started thinking about it and thought about it for decades, and I'm still figuring out why it may be of interest to me. I was 21, 22. I was living in Toronto, and in 1981 in Toronto, Asia Torah opened up its first branch, and through either accident or fate, whatever moves you, the people who were running the branch ended up living on the same street as I did. I didn't know anything about, Orthodox Judaism, and really was not that interested in such. But as life would happen, a very good friend of mine who I was going through English literature with, his roommate became, they have this verb now, aished. He became aished.
Is it good? Is it good to be aished?
I think the people who use it derogatorily. I'm fairly neutral on this. I don't really care, but that's the verb they use. So, and then it was like dominoes, right? Because it was these three brothers, the Shore brothers from London, Ontario, right? So one of the brothers, Robert Shore, was roommates with my very good friend Joel Hecker, who's still my very good friend, who teaches mysticism at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. And Robert's brother Phil, and the third brother was David Shore. David Shore is actually the most famous of the Shore brothers because he created House and all these other big television shows. And he's the one who's not religious. But the two other brothers became big time, sort of operators in Asia Torah. And so it was a domino. Phil went first. And then, Robert said to Joel, my brother, went crazy here. He went off and he became religious. And lo and behold, right, so the irony, so Robert fell next. And then Joel fell, right? So I was sort of looking around thinking, So Joel said, we would go out every week after our, Marxism and literature seminar. We'd go out and drink and we'd talk about things. And then one day he said to me, he's taking these classes. So I went and I learned something they called the 48 Ways of Wisdom, which is based on, the last chapter of Pirkei Avot. And it was this home study group in 1982. And I knew nothing about Orthodox Judaism. So, you ask yourself, here you are here and here you are now, and how do you get from A to B? And I think, in retrospect, there's certain attractions, almost like this long-distance magnet, and slowly but surely, something is compelling you, something is pulling you in, and probably because the circle of people I was with, there was a certain restlessness, a certain lack of groundedness, almost a kind of loneliness.
Can I just turn the question back on you?
Yeah,
I had a conversation with somebody pretty recently. I don't know if we spoke about it. Somebody who used to work for Aish, and he said, I guess they have some booklet, which is the 48 ways to make somebody from. And he said, if give me, 2 hours with somebody and my book, and I can make a person from. It's like, here is a recipe book to change somebody's life. Quite apart from the fact that a lot of these issues that get discussed in Kiruv seminars are issues that, we know have been discussed not only in our tradition. I teach Milton's Theodicy, Paradise Lost, about, justifying the ways of God to man. And I ask my students to get a sense of that problem of theodicy, which is the whole question of suffering. And in 5 minutes, one of the students will give me their Shabbos table drush, that solves the problem. I said, you could have saved Milton and Aquinas and Dante and Homer and Aeschylus a lot of time, right? You did it in 5 minutes. I'm just wondering, reflecting on this, were you, is there some sense, I mean, maybe I'm speaking a little bit autobiographically here, is there some sense of embarrassment maybe that, maybe this worked on you?
Oh, I see, like that. I
Yeah.
think it's a very complicated picture. I think that when you talk about cure of organizations, usually people either sanctify them or they demonize them. It's very sort of black and white. My experience has been much more mixed and somewhat ambivalent. On the one hand, I actually feel appreciative to the people who introduced me to the world of learning and experience that I really do enjoy, actually. On the other hand, I obviously left that world a very long time ago, so clearly there was something that was unpalatable to me about it. But I think that there's a measure of gratitude and there's a measure of caution, that goes into it. I think that the part that hit me, actually I handed out a sheet just because some of the things that I thought about I wanted you to read while I talk about them. So at the time I was reading The Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. I was in college. There's certain things that you read when you're, I think between 18 and 25, and you read Hess, and
That
you
might
read,
be 16
right,
to 18.
and 16 to 18, Hebron, and so I was reading Merton because I was really interested in this notion of a monastic life, why a person would leave civilization, Thomas Merton was a guy who became a Trappist monk in a monastery in Kentucky, and he wrote this book, which you would not think would be like one of the great religious bestsellers of the century, but it just sold a truckload of copies. And he said something in it, you can look in source number 1, that was very striking to me at that time, that I still remember. He says, "We live in a society whose whole policy is to excite every nerve in the human body and keep it at the highest pitch of artificial tension, to strain every human desire to the limit and to create as many desires and synthetic passions as possible in order to cater to them with the products of our factories and printing presses and movie studios and all the rest," right? So that actually spoke to me. I felt like there was something inauthentic about what was surrounding me, and I didn't know what I was reaching for. So that's the thing, is you're reaching for something, but you don't actually know what you're reaching for. So I don't remember anything of those 48 ways classes. But I do remember that something was evolving for me in the sense of reaching for it. I mean, on a conventional level, there was a very severe dollop of a kind of anti-Western critique going on. But see, I'd already experienced that because in college, Alan Bloom was my professor, and he used us all as kind of guinea pigs to talk about, the ills of relativism and all that stuff. So I was already used to that kind of thing. So I was kind of waiting for that kind of critique to pass. And when it passed, what was left in its wake were Jewish texts, which I found really exciting. So for me anyway, the more I was left alone, the better Judaism got. So it was like that for me.
So maybe you're part of my Miltonic Judaism, right?
I don't mean left alone in terms of having nobody around me, but I didn't need to be pitched or sold or that kind of thing. So that's what appealed to me. What appealed to you? Something must have spoken to you.
Well, again, there are different ways of telling the story. And I try to kind of weed out the parts of the story which make me ask questions about, people do things in their lives and we look back on them and we can look at them from a very kind of vulgar Freudian perspective or a very vulgar anthropological or sociological perspective. And people can really just say the whole Kirov movement in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s when it became strong was maybe, a reaction to the counterculture, in some sense a continuation of the counterculture, a desire for a more benevolent kind of authority. There are personal ways of telling the story in a Freudian manner. And I spent like a lot of the last decade looking at my past from those kinds of perspectives. But I think, this is what I meant before about being about Tshuvah, and trying to take it out of the cliche, being about Tshuvah, and re-choosing and retelling that story, and re-relating to the past. So I think part of the story that I was feeling is I was in graduate school, and I was sitting around a very big brown oak table in a seminar room in Philosophy Hall, and studying literary theory that was coming out of France, literary theory that was coming out of Yale, literary theory that was coming out of California. And my first exposure to rabbinic text was that the rabbis are dealing with the same kinds of issues. And courting what Jeffrey Goldberg called this epistemic pluralism. What's epistemic mean, by the way?
Knowledge.
Oh, so epistemic means this kind of a knowledge which is based upon pluralism. That I found that the rabbis were doing the same kinds of things as my teachers were doing, yet the rabbis were doing it in a context in which people were actually talking to one another. And what I found in graduate school is it was a kind of culture of real shrillness and not really a culture that could develop into community. They're really just isolated individuals. I think maybe that's the individualism you were really talking about. So for me, I was also very drawn to, I discovered, Halachic Man by Rabbi Soloveitchik, and I thought, wow, right? Because, I remember my very good friend Shlomo Felberman was sitting here, and he took me to a yeshiva, Chaim Berlin, in Brooklyn. It must have been in 1981 or 82. And we had a chavrusa with somebody, and we were learning the sugya. And the guy was a very nice guy, but he went right into the sugya. There was no methodological introduction. There was no attempt to say, this is how the Gemara works. This is what's happening, right? I mean, if we ever start our own yeshiva, that methodology will be foregrounded. And well, the methodology part of starting the yeshiva part.
No, bite your tongue. You're not starting the yeshiva.
Yeah. Anyway, and I just thought, maybe there would be some people who would just connect to that kind of study, but I just didn't. And when I read Rabbi Soloveitchik, I thought, wow, this is a person who speaks my language. This is a person who has read the same kind of text that I've read. And for me, that was a kind of revelation. I mean, it was almost like this was like a heter. It was like some kind of permission to keep on going. Like, I had thought for so many years, growing up where I grew up in this wealthy suburb in Long Island, the stereotype of the frum Jew was not unlike the stereotype of what it is now, closed-minded. And when I read Rabbi Soloveitchik, I thought, well, this is somebody who is speaking the same language, and maybe he knows something that I don't. And that was kind of, I think, for me, it was just like this moment of intellectual humility and spending your whole life trying to master certain traditions, literary traditions, philosophical traditions, and then finding out there was this other tradition which everybody else had told you was nonsense, and then you actually do have access to it. And like you said, when you finally had access to these texts, it was like, oh, or like, wow, simultaneously.
I didn't actually jump into Jewish philosophy right away. I was just grinding it out, trying to figure out, the Hebrew, the Aramaic, word by word by word by word by word. If you look at my Talmuds from 1983, it's like every second word is translated into English. I wasn't thinking in grand terms. I think for me, it was more of an experiential. I like the idea of commitment. I think that's what really spoke to me then. I like the idea of something being non-negotiable because I felt like I lived in a world where everything was kind of tradable. Like if you didn't like it, you could sort of discard it. And I think that ironically, it was kind of the difficulty of it, the sort of hardness of it that spoke to me. There was one sort of Rubicon moment for me. I'm a very big fan of the American writer Raymond Carver, who's long gone now, but he was a short story writer that I thought was immensely talented in various ways. And I was a big fan of his work, and he died of lung cancer in 1988, but he made one appearance in Toronto, and it was on a Friday night, and I had just really become Shomer Shabbat. It was a long way from where I lived, and I basically had to decide, am I going to go see this man who's really a literary hero of mine, or am I going to stay home in my apartment and keep Shabbat? And I chose to keep Shabbat. And even though it wasn't, in retrospect, like a grand cosmic moment, for me, it was a crossing.
It's quiet heroism.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was like, okay, you can do this. You can give things up and feel like your life isn't shattered. And I think the very relinquishing of it, but this is very complicated, right? Because as you move further into the religious life, this notion of relinquishing actually becomes a dagger, a Damocles sword that's held over you. Because if you don't want to relinquish, in other words, if you say, you know what, I don't actually have to give that up. So you have to now parry with the idea of whether you're actually sinning or living a rational life, because there's a guilt then associated with not relinquishing, and there's an irony, right? Because the thing that moved you in the beginning, which is, I like the idea that you don't have to give something up, is now coming back at you and saying, well, I thought you were the one who was all hip with the idea of not being able to relinquish. So why don't you give away this part of yourself, and why do you give away that part of yourself. So I think
And I guess
that's
if you,
that's
I
hard.
guess if you move to certain communities in Jerusalem or Israel, that becomes even more of a value.
Right.
I live in Bayit Vagan, right? As does Rabbi Cardozo, where relinquishing is the mantra and the motto.
So tell us about Bayit Vagan.
Rabbi Cardozo. I have some excellent neighbors in Bayit Vagan. It's lonely in Bayit Vagan. It's lonely.
You felt you did too much relinquishing?
Changed.
Yeah. I think I've just become much more skeptical about I was thinking of Rabbi Cardozo's metaphor that used about a decade ago about the Jewish world and Jewish texts being a kind of symphony with many voices. And I think the music that, unfortunately, and I'm sorry to characterize it in this way, and I don't really like doing it, but the music I think that comes out of certain parts of the Orthodox world is just a dirge now, a monovocal dirge. And it doesn't really accommodate a lot of different voices. I was reading an 18th century figure, the third Earl of Shaftesbury. My wife said, "Oh, you're writing about another irrelevant English person. That'll be really great for your Parnassa." Super, right? So Shaftesbury writes in his brilliant piece on a tract called About Enthusiasm, a letter on enthusiasm, that every kind of enthusiasm is informed by what he calls a kind of melancholy. That every kind of very earnest desire, and when people especially want to actively, convert you or teach you, underlying it is what Shaftesbury refers to melancholy. I think Freud would also call it a kind of melancholy, meaning this undercut of doubt and uncertainty. And the more that doubt and uncertainty kind of rears its head privately, the more simultaneously, publicly, you feel that very strong public voice of, be like me. Shaftesbury also says that regularity is a kind of deformity. And I think we see that deformity in certain Orthodox communities. The truth is you see them in every community. I think Orthodoxy just lends itself, Jewish life lends itself to the perception or the refinement, unfortunately, of that kind of deformity. So there's really a kind of lack of hearing those kinds of alternative voices, and I think we see more and more. And I've become more understanding, because I think it's not just a problem of the Orthodox, it's a problem of living in a contemporary Israel, which is divided between very strong belief and a certain kind of non-reflective skepticism, or I would even say cynicism. And Orthodoxy situates itself, it's not only Israel, it's really just the modern world. It's probably the modern world since the 17th century, but it's especially the modern world since the Holocaust, since the founding of the State of Israel, that we've just broken up into two camps. So the Orthodox have become much, much, much more defensive, I think, and much less willing to open themselves up to conversation, which might be true, and we've seen it in political terms in the last election. It's really becoming worrying. What's most worrying, I think, about the last election is the extent to which left and right are just no longer talking to each other at all. And I think that political reality is just reflective of a theological reality in general. So Bayit Vagan tends, I think, to pushing down those other voices, pushing down those voices of pluralism, pushing down whatever natural voices people have. I mean, you were talking about, becoming religious in opposition to that sense of Western desire and entitlement, and I definitely did as well. But I think for me now, a lot of the project for me personally is to reclaim that desire, and to reclaim individual voices, to hear individual voices, as heretical or as deviant as they may be sometimes.
Well, because let's face it, every Baal Tshuvah is a rebel. No matter how you want to slice it, all these nice peons to your parents, and they're wonderful people. You are in rebellion. You are in full-scale, outright rejection of what you were given. So you can.
And look at us now,
You can serve. It'll come home to roost somehow. And the question then becomes, how nuanced can it get? Can it get after that? I think for me. What began to happen is that I felt a growing sense of disturbance about the Bali Tshuvah I would meet, and I didn't have a voice for it, I didn't have words for it, but it was bothering me because, and that there's an odd dynamic going on. Your sort of rebellion, rejection is an energy, like you're moving, and that's really the energy of rock and roll in some ways. It's like you're moving fast away from something because you have to spring yourself. It's like the space shuttle. Like you have to move into orbit. So you really have to break out of the thing that you're in. But so you're moving towards religion. But at some point, an ambivalence is setting in, and you're almost feeling like I want to reverse course. Well, I mean, and you don't want to reverse course back to the life you knew. So now you're actually swirling around in this odd place because the energy that took you there was a genuine impulse. I want to live a new life. But that new life is then bound up with all sorts of orthodox sociologies, the people, the community, the kinds of messages that are given to you. So you're sort of slowing down because you're saying some of this is very abhorrent to me. It's repugnant to me. Attitudes about, gender and attitudes about Gentiles and etc. We all know the list. So right. Then it's a long list, right? So there's this odd energy going on because you're moving away from something, and the thing you're moving to, you also want to move away. You're rejecting your own rejection of what took place. So I think just on simple, concrete terms, it bothers me greatly when Bali Tshuvah, whom I know, I'm not necessarily ashamed of their past, but they don't seem to embrace fully all the talent that they have, all the creativity that they have, the notion that they have to somehow fit in with communities that really deride their talents, and as well that in any other part of their life, in any other area of their life, where they would bring all of their acumen to bear, right? Intellectually sharp, emotionally sensitive, right? They know what's true. Turns to mush. Right. Mush when it comes to like religious authority or messages they're getting. So you're so smart. How did you turn into this like passive? Because that is the Damocles sword of religious authority. It's like you can say that out there, but in here, these are our ground rules, and you have to play by those. And if you don't, you're a sinner. So that becomes a difficult proposition.
Right. I remember sitting in yeshiva and hearing people who I would respect saying things that I didn't respect, right, about Goyim, about Schwarzes. And I thought at the time, I was learning so much, I was learning so much about Jewish texts and tradition. And as you said, it was this kind of ambivalent. I thought, I'm going to bracket this right now. I'm not going to address these questions. And I remember telling people who were asking me about my religiosity or my turn to Judaism and maybe asking their own questions. I said, sometimes you have to bracket certain questions. And I think that's true. Because if you don't bracket certain questions, you'll maybe stay in the same place. But at a certain point, you have to ask those questions. And I think that's probably in the life process that we're in, we're really starting to, or maybe, I think you started asking much earlier than I did, going back to asking those questions. Meaning, how is it that the person who is standing in as a kind of authority figure for you seems to be not only that there are, to me it's not just the issue that a person is homophobic or racist or misogynist. It's the lack of self-consciousness about that perspective. I mean, I don't like any of those things, the first three things, but it's just the lack of self-awareness. And it seems, I think one of the things that I valued, and I know you valued as well about the Jewish tradition, is the processes of learning. Not even Jewish philosophy, but the processes of learning just emphasize that sense of self-consciousness, being aware of, when I'm learning, I'm always learning with another person, and I'm seeing things always from more than one perspective. So how can this be? Right? How can the Talmid Chacham, who's meant to internalize this dialectic or this dialogue, who's meant to see things always from different perspectives, can't see these things about themselves? And I think those are just troubling questions about just the culture of orthodoxy today and how the culture of orthodoxy, if we're in fact part of that. I don't know. I mean, I see you at shul sometimes. It is an orthodox shul we go to, right? Right. So right. I know. I think we live these lives. I mean, I go to the same shuls that Rabbi Cardozo goes, and I don't necessarily really feel part of them. But I like being there.
But that's the hardest call, right? The hardest call is that you see the person that you should revere, and you realize they're saying things that you don't revere, but you also know that if you simply reject that cynically and you go all the way the other way and just cast all religious authority with one brush, so now you're really in a bad place, because you're trying to calibrate this very delicate balance between reverence for something that's bigger than you, with maintaining an independent critical stance of thought. And the truth is, those things aren't necessarily always reconcilable. It's not like there is this perfect medium, this middle between, casting off authority and reverence for authority and maintaining critical thought. It's not really a medium, it's a pendulum. You're swinging back and forth trying to
for me, that's
fine-tune it.
For me, that in a way, just the metaphor of the pendulum is kind of like a Tshuvah nightmare. That may be like, what if we are just these products of modernity that always want to be in some form of rebellion? So I'll be, and we'll get to rock and roll, I hope, in a minute. I'll be, a wild teenager in college, and I'll go to one extreme. And then, to the surprise and dismay of everybody you'll go to another extreme, and they'll remind you of that extreme. And then you'll get to that extreme, and you'll be like, uh-oh, I'm here. And then you'll go back to that extreme. That's kind of living out this modern, when I say modern, I don't mean 21st century, even 20th century. I mean like 17th century and onward. Like, where am I? Am I embracing freedom and liberty, or am I embracing authority? And I think the mature person, and I think it's very hard to be that person, the mature person, maybe your metaphor, the calibrated person, the sane person, somehow escapes that and finds some kind of place or peace with which one can, as you say, calibrate, or just find some kind of balance.
So I don't think you plan out the pendulum.
No.
I think you are living it, and it works out that way, and because I don't strive for freedom or authority. I think about truth. I think about what's true for my life, and sometimes it moves towards thinking about freedom, and sometimes it's about authority. But I think that it's just starting with a stance that when there are certain things that happen to you, that you trust your gut instinct. Right? I was in graduate school. I was just finishing my coursework before I was doing my thesis. I was doing a seminar on Dickens and Elliott. Right, so
which Elliott?
George. Yeah. So I'm not such a big Dickens person, but I really grew to like George Elliott. And so I'm reading The Mill on the Floss, and it's late in the book, and there's this line by this character who Elliott clearly doesn't like, Mr. Dean, if you've ever read the novel, and he's saying to one of the characters, he's trying to give him a piece of advice, which he thinks is good advice. And the line is, it's in number 3 here, if you want to slip into a round hole, you must make a ball of yourself. And that really hit me. I think I was around, 26 years old. And this is what it is. If you want to fit in, you got to like contract yourself into this ball, and you'll slip right through. So something about that really bothered me. And I realized that, what am I making my ball into for what? So it's one thing if I'm going to keep Shabbat, but not everything that comes out of people's mouths is the gospel. So I remember much later on, many years later, after marriage and kids, so this guy came to a local shul in Toronto. I'm not going to name him because it bothered me. Right? I am, right? So it's a man who lives here in Israel named Rabbi Lazer Brody, and he said stuff that day that I then found him saying online. So I just want you to see it on, because I'm giving it, it's public record, and I'm giving an example of where you now have to recalibrate. So he said, you feel anxious or depressed, and then you know there's a problem. The solution lies not in the psychologist and the pills we take, because they don't deal with the root of the problem. What our souls need is to connect. They need emunah, right? And later on in another interview, he said that, basically antidepressants are just basically a Yetzer Hara. So that's the kind of thing that Bali Tshuvah go to, and they look at the lecture and they think, there's a problem in my emunah, and psychologists are bad, and pills are bad, and this is bad. Those modernity is really not a good thing. So
really dangerous stuff, right?
So I'm using that as I don't know this person, it doesn't really matter to me. I'm using it as an exemplar of the kinds of things that are false, that you're told are a necessary part of what your package needs to be religiously. And so I think the big issue is to discern what is the genuine thing that is part of a spiritual life,
Right.
and what isn't, which is obviously easier said than done.
I think you're really talking about a general phenomenon where giving advice sometimes is more for the benefit of the person who's giving the advice than for the person who's getting the advice.
Perhaps, you know, and I mean, along the same lines, if I can just add to it. So, the same notion of what is a necessary component of religious life struck me very early on at yeshiva, you know, so I was at Aish Torah in 1983, 1984, and there was actually many wonderful things about it, right? I'm not here to bash the place. I made good friends. I learned a lot of Torah. It was very inspirational in some ways. But there were parts of it that just negated how I felt intellectually. I felt then, and I basically feel now, that there's essentially a theology of uncertainty, that we have to have a lot of epistemological humility, that we believe things, but we don't necessarily know them. And I was running up against the fact that educationally they were producing classes called, you know, proofs of Torah, proofs of God. Right? Proofs of God to me is an oxymoron. It doesn't fit into my emotional lexicon. I don't understand it. Right? So my family knows this story that I've told my family many times, that I guess the great rebuke to this was one day in the yeshiva. In those days, people remember the 80s. It was like the Wild West of Kiruv. People would like schlep people off the hotel, and they would bring them upstairs.
Right. You have to escape from
you know,
Torah.
and they would, you know, these kids in like shorts and, you know, hiking boots and those funny little kippot they give them at the wall. And so here they were. And the thing of it is the guy talking to the guy probably had been this guy like 2 months earlier, right? So he's giving him the benefit of all of this wisdom. And I'm not trying to say this sardonically, it's just empirically true. That's what happened. So he says to him, so he's going through this regimen of proofs of God and proofs of Torah. So there's a class they used to do which was called Know What You Know. This kind of creation of epistemological certainty, right? So Know What You Know is there to prove that God exists. So the kid asked what I consider just a first level rational question, which is, how do I know God exists? I don't see him, I don't smell him, I don't touch him, I don't taste him. There's no empirical evidence. So instead of, from my point of view, doing what would be the reasonable, humble thing, which is say, you're absolutely right. That's not how Jewish tradition approaches faith issues. What the guy answered was, how do you know that's your leg? True story. So the kid, who was peeved, I would have been too, got up and stomped out of the Beit Midrash like this, because I'm using them to get them out of here. That's what happened. And he left. That was the kind of, yes, absolutely. I was actually deeply amused by that. I was actually off in the corner learning Mishnah, but I think I just sort of went like that. You know? But the point here was, my real point here is, it's all so unnecessary. It's all so unnecessary. In other words, my real feeling about, you know, you talked about, you know, racism and misogyny and so on. It's all so unnecessary. If this is all a way of protecting the tradition, if it's all there to make sure that everybody buys in, then everybody should relax. Because this sort of disease called obsession with continuity has forced sort of religion to take extreme positions, because we're so afraid that we're going to lose everybody, so we have to like go all in, poker-wise, on every single conversation. And the thing is, you're going to outstretch your hand. You really are. You don't have the cards. So let's all pull back, say what we think, give what we have, know what we know, instead of having to like prove that God exists and do all this stuff, which is all fear-based religion. It's all basically, I'm scared you're going to walk out of this place, so I'm going to have to throw everything at you. And it was all so unnecessary. Like in my own case, as I said, the less you talk to me, the more you just teach me the text, the better it'll be.
I have another question in relationship to that. I mean, you know, how normative are you? meaning.
I think you better ask my children about that one. You know.
Or maybe I'll put it another way. You know, Elliott ran Torah in Motion in Toronto for many years, and I'm wondering just about the role of pedagogy, meaning you're telling everybody we should relax, and you used the word inspire before. Should we teach or should we inspire? Or, I mean, is there a role for? I mean, there are a lot of qualified people here to answer that question here. Is there a role for inspirational talks? I mean, or should we always be suspicious of people who are trying to inspire us?
Do you think Milton was trying to inspire? Or are you inspired by Milton? In other words, doesn't the inspiration just flow out of what the person's integrity and truth and intellectual
I'm actually in the
rigor
middle.
is, and
I'm
that's
actually
just
in,
inspirational?
I'm actually in the middle of a life crisis because the Miltonic part. I teach English literature. The Miltonic part of my brain is fighting with the Shakespearean part of my brain, and I think the Shakespearean part of my brain is taking over for precisely these reasons. Because Milton, I mean, the thing about teaching Milton, which I find really easy, is that he has a very clear voice, and all you have to try to do is get your students who are very resistant to his voice to hear his voice, and when they do, it's like a revelation because his voice is so complex and interesting. But when you read Shakespeare, it's like, where is his voice? I mean, Shakespeare's voice is some mediated in the interstices of the text or between the words of the text. That's kind of where my question is coming from. I mean, sure, I'm inspired by Milton, but Milton is such a skeptic that it's easy to be inspired by him. I mean, the thing about Milton, the reason I love Milton so much is he's just such a committed person theologically, but also he's the greatest skeptic there is.
But don't you find, like, music, right?
Yeah.
People don't, when Keith Jarrett sat down on the piano in 1976 and did the Colm concert, which is one of the most brilliant...
Keith Jarrett, and who is he again?
He's the jazz pianist, right? One of the most brilliant pieces of contemporary music, right? I don't think he sat down in the piano in the concert hall and said, you know what, I'm going to be inspirational tonight, right? You know, when you know, Keith Richard tells a story about how he came up with the tuning for...
Do you guys all know Keith Richards?
Sorry.
No clue.
No clue.
Oh, Rolling Stones. Start over. All right, we'll start over. Okay.
We're really orthodox.
You really are. Anyway, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Beggar's Banquet, 1968. Anyway, you'll figure it out. All right, so
you all have homework now.
He's telling the story about how the open D tuning he used for coming up with Jumping Jack Flash, right? I don't think they sat down and said, we're going to write like one of the greatest bridges in rock and roll history. Like, he hit 90 seconds of the song, and Keith goes into this fantastic guitar part. I don't think he like sat there at the beginning and said, you know what, I want to inspire. You do what you do, right? Bill, when you're on and you're teaching and you're grooving, you didn't walk in the day and said, Kolbrener, let's be inspirational. You do what you do, and that's what's inspirational. If you're true to the voice that you've got, that's going to inspire.
I think that's true, but I think there is, I wonder if teachers here would agree with me, there's a performative aspect to teaching. You know, one of the reasons that teaching Romeo and Juliet for 4 hours yesterday was so difficult was I was not only thinking about Shakespeare, but also thinking about how am I going to get these 40, 25-year-old women to be interested in Romeo and Juliet, which turns out was not very hard. But that's, I think there is a certain kind of performative aspect in what we do. And
Are you afraid of it?
I'm much more careful about it. I think there's a way in which, especially, I think, Elliott, you're more, forgive me for saying this, and I think it's more really a compliment. In relationship to this, you're much more of a Tom. I mean, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. Life today is performative, right? Everybody wants to be, and people want to be inspired. And I'm thinking, you know, I don't really want to inspire you, I want to teach you. I mean, but that has been really a kind of transformation for me. Because I think there was a time in which I really wanted, when I myself wanted to be like somebody who looked like I knew something, meaning, and that's when I was much more part of what we would call the ultra-Orthodox world. I wanted really to be that inspirational speaker. And I think as I pulled away from that, here my question really is, as I pulled away from that, I've emphasized much more teaching and less inspiration. And I'm wondering if I'm doing that at a cost. I'm wondering if I'm missing something now. If I should go back to that other persona of, you know, the more inspirational. Because after all, You know, that's the currency today, right? We're so grateful everybody is here today listening to us, but we were expecting 500 people.
We
Right? Well, whatever. We were fantasizing about 500 people, right? Whatever. Let's just go with it, Elliott. Okay. So I'm just wondering, if we're giving up something and not trying to inspire, because there are those who do that, and in various venues and in various contexts, they're getting those.
There's a certain dishonesty in inspiration.
I don't know. That's kind of what I'm asking. I don't think necessarily, but I think sometimes, yes. I think there's this I think in every pedagogical situation, there's a desire to please or be pleasing. There's a desire, and this is, I think, what we said was characterized by the Kirov movement at a certain point, be like me. And really, that's the kind of the worst part of the Kirov movement. And I think it's a little bit of a paradox. I think one of the questions Elliott and I were discussing was, what do we like most about our Jewish observance? And the thing I like most about my Jewish observance is it's taught me how to be grateful. And I'm being very ungrateful now. Because I think the people who brought me close to Judaism, I am a little bit suspicious of, because very much a part of what they were doing was, I really need you to be like me. I need you to, it was really very much their need. And I think we see the Kirov movement really, especially in America now, with a lot of the money that's going into it. I know a program at Yale which is closing down, which is a fantastic program led by a great person, but he's not getting people to make Israel trips and sign up in yeshivot and seminaries, and that's how they index the money. Instead of, I think the index should just be, are you reading Jewish texts? Are you reading stuff? Are you getting this exposure? So so we just see that at an institutional level as well. That we need you to be like us, and we're going to gear all of our Kirov, even the finances of it, on account of it.
I think performative acts are performative acts. I don't think they're inspirational. I think they're performance. Okay. And I think it's rooted in in acedia, in spiritual boredom. I think when people, I can say personally that one of the reasons that I perform when I teach is because I'm bored. Right? That's the dirty little secret that nobody likes to talk about in education, but it's true. You get bored. You get bored, and people get bored with you, and I never understood how people could sit in a seat for 8 hours a day in a school.
You're not bored now, are you?
No, I'm not bored now. I'm doing fine. I think that there's a part of it that you're trying to entertain yourself, and I think there's a part of it where you're trying to entertain other people, but I think if the entertainment becomes the core of it, I was never inspired by people's entertainment. I thought it was bullshit. I did. I felt I could see right through it. If you have an idea, and the idea is real, and you better make it good, then it hit me. I don't care, Now, obviously, if it's dead, drop, dull, right? If the person just cannot get the idea out, so that's a problem. Yes, it is. But it doesn't need to be slick, perfect camera, Tony Robbins, we're selling you, life kind of, it doesn't have to be. The idea better be there then, and that's the inspirational. That's what it was for me. So the performative was like something else. Again, I'll give you a good example, okay? Changed my life, non-performance at all. I'm sitting in my room. My family makes fun of this. I lived in this tiny apartment for 12 years as a student. And I would sit there night after night after night with my desk and my one bulb lamp, and I could read for long periods of time. One of the reasons I read for long periods of time is I'm a very slow reader. So I'm a plotter. I'm not a racer. So I'm reading of grammatology, okay, which if you know literary theory was Jacques Derrida's book, among several books that I didn't understand. But I tried, right? So here I am, and I'm reading it, and then all of a sudden I read this sentence. The sign is always a sign of the fall. And that sentence, the sign is always a sign of the fall, changed my life. Why? Because here I am I'll explain, I'm doing Judaism. And Judaism is this idea that God revealed Torah at Sinai, and there's this quest for God, and there's this mitzvah and halakha, whatever words you want to use. And Derrida is telling me, you know what, this thing in your hand, all these texts and all these rituals, they're the guarantee that God is absent. Because every sign is a sign that something's not there, right? Think of a gravestone. You come to a cemetery, you look at a grave, right? And we're very compelled by gravestones because it's reminding us the person who died, right? I go to my dad's grave and I look at, and you know what happens every time I go to my dad's grave and I look at that gravestone? I think to myself, you're not here anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The sign is always a sign that the thing is gone. That's what signs remind you of, not presence, but absence. And when I fully internalized that, my Judaism became a lot humbler. Because it wasn't like, oh, you know, we've got the truth. It was like, I'm striving, I'm trying. That was a very silent, non-public, non-charismatic moment, you know? So I realized that some people like performance, but in the end, my belief, I think we shortchange people all the time. We think they need the slick thing, but I think what they really want is the true thing. They want the deep thing. They don't want the slick thing, because after a while, it just fades. That's how I think about performance.
Why don't you go then for something like conservative Judaism, where you probably will find more of that stuff than in the Orthodox world?
I'm not sure I understand what the question's asking.
I'm asking, you have so many questions about the orthodoxy, with which I agree, but why do you stay then within that framework?
That's a good question. It is a good question. Because there's a significant part of me that hopes that it's true, that believes that it's possible. Those are the words I use. I can't say I know. I can't say I know God exists. I can't say that I know that God gave Torah Sinai, but I do have that hope. I think it is possible. And I'll tell you something that will be odd to you. I have my best conversations in Orthodoxy. Because it's the friction. That's why, you know, when you think about the erotic, what's really erotic? It's the people with their clothes on, right? If you look at old-fashioned movie, when you have an old-fashioned movie where the character is seduced or is about to fall, there's real eros on the screen there. There's real eros in the text, right? Test of the D'Urbervilles, much more erotic than, you know, Penthouse, because of the forbidden, because of what's stacked up against it. So in Orthodoxy, it's the very boundaries and the pushing against the boundaries and the searching for the truth inside the boundaries that creates the kinetic conversation. When you collapse, there's not, for me anyway, that's the kinetic conversation.
Maybe we can transition
Yes.
to the last part of our talk.
Yes.
I thought of one way of asking the question is, I think a philosophical way of asking the question is the relationship between aesthetics and ethics. Is there a relationship, another way of putting it in a classical tradition would be a relationship between art and virtue. Or another way of asking the question is, why do Orthodox Jews have such bad taste? Why is that necessary? Is it necessary? Or I mean, because we know in the classical tradition there is an assumption that there will be a relationship or can be a relationship between aesthetics and virtue. Yet so often we see in the religious tradition, like if somebody has bad taste, is that, I mean, I have to confess, if I go into somebody's house and they have really ugly art on their wall, it makes me think less of them as a person. So, I didn't think I quite. So just, I'm really interested in the role of the aesthetic in your life. I mean, you know, the title Tshuvah, Drugs and Rock and Roll was not just meant to inspire, oops, it was meant actually to, you know, to correlate with some of the things we talk about.
I mean, I think you know, and I know that art, when it's really there, speaks to you on a very very deep level, and it's not. There's no artifice about it, ironically, right? So the people who I love, right, who are just inside of me, are very meaningful. You know, it's just you can't avoid it. So when you see, you know, when you see for whatever sort of visual art you like, there's a kind of, it speaks to you on a level, right? That C.S. Lewis said, we read to know we are not alone. And I think that's true. I think that's profoundly true. I think there's a connection that you're making with humanity, right? So I never found these experiences neutral. You know, whatever it is you like. I mean, we may like the same things, we may like different things, but you know, whether it's Shakespeare or Beckett or you know, when I first read To the Lighthouse the first time, I was in a trance. I was transfixed by this idea of this boy remembering how he's not going to go, and he was promised, and it was so inside of it. It was so underneath it right? So I found that that could really speak to me. I think that people have an alienation from the aesthetic now because they think of it as a kind of dandy, decadent, over-academized thing, right? What we do in the humanities, we crushed literature, right? I mean, all the MLA conferences that both of us have been to, right? And all the hundreds of papers on the minutiae, and the very spirit of it got crushed. But if you get past it, it's still a person sitting on a bench reading their book, and it's speaking to them about their life, you know? So I don't see that as trivial.
Is it not a pan-halachic problem, as Heschel would call it? In the sense,
Pan-halachic.
P-A-N, pan-halachic, in the sense that since everything has been halachalized, to the point that there is nothing else anymore left within the Orthodox world, that therefore art, music, all these things are gone because they can't find a place within the halachic world as they see it, at least. And therefore you get a kind of behaviorism, things continue like this.
Itself is such a beautiful construction.
You had a question in the back?
It's kind of self-contradictory.
So you're going through this now. My generation is totally going through it. Why are you still in it?
Well, that's more or less the question I asked.
Right, that's the question you asked. And your answer is great. We hope and we think maybe there is truth to it. But like why you're questioning a lot of things, and you seem to have done a lot of studies, and you're both professors. It doesn't really make sense, really, if you think about it. Like, we are doing and we think and we hope, but like what?
Can I ask you what makes sense? What makes sense?
Even the other world doesn't make sense when you look at it. You think, wow, that doesn't even make sense. I think we're screwed either way. Excuse my language. But the other thing was that you said a lot of people wanted, like, encouraged you through wanting them to be like them, like wanting you to be like them. But I actually think that the people who actually do that kind of work see something that is beautiful, and they're like, oh, I want your soul to experience that. And I think that's what they're trying to. And I'm sure there's people in that world who are like, I'm doing it, and you like me.
And there might be people who are really doing both at the same time.
Right.
And, you know,
So I would like to know how you have a next generation, you're teaching your kids, and you live in Gun, which is a very orthodox.
very.
So like how do you like daily, I don't know, how do you daily live with it?
You know, I think there are a lot, I think, you just raised a great question, and I think there are a lot of answers to it. I think one of the ways that I deal with it personally is really recognizing that people are not so simple, that they have different voices. A psychoanalyst might say we have hybrid voices. We speak with different voices, and to listen to all of them. And I have a friend from Yeshiva University who used to ask me very suspiciously, are you bifurcated? Which was somehow the worst thing in the world. And my answer finally is I'm not bifurcated, I'm trifurcated, I'm multificated. And that's okay. It's okay to have different voices, I think. And I think that's part of not feeling that sense of transgressiveness. I mean, part of it, I think the thing that I would say to young people is there really is such, just as we would say learning Western philosophical texts or literary texts give you a language to think about things. Jewish texts give you a language not only about how to think about things, but really how to live. And they give a certain kind of texture to your life. And it's that texture, I think, and the tensions and the questions that that texture gives you that really make things, I said, gratitude. And I think there's also just a sense of I hate saying this because it sounds so cliched, but the way in which Jewish texts assume or presuppose or allow a certain kind of Jewish family life, which I find, looking at my friends in America, even my family in America, that they really look on, after 20 years, when my friends from high school with such skepticism and such anger and such cynicism, and they come and visit me and they see my family, and, it's not like we're all these, my kids are like, I think what they think they like, what they admire about my family is simultaneously a certain sense of cohesiveness, but also that they all have their own voices. And somehow, even in this tradition, which can be very closed, you can cultivate your own voice. And maybe even, I think this is probably why we were attracted to Judaism, maybe even the tradition actually helps you find your own voice, or find some of those voices, find ways of expressing yourself we're never able to do. And that's really, I talked about gratitude. I'm really just grateful for that, just on a personal level, in a relationship to my family. So I would see, if you have the opportunity living in Jerusalem with all these resources, to just make your life more rich.
I think people get tripped up by Orthodox sociology a lot.
Right.
There's first of all, I just want to say, most of the Kiru people I've ever met in my life, I've met quite a number, I think are wonderful people. I do. I think they do noble work. I think they're idealistic. I think they're doing things that, frankly, in over 25 years of doing education in North America, a lot of people don't do that. People, like, I taught high school for a long time. People want the money. They go out and they want to get the corporate grab, and that's fine. That's cool. But having said that, I think it's a remarkable thing when people want to go out and do that other kind of work. Now, are there people who do it who have messianic pretensions, who are control freaks? Maybe. But the vast majority of them, I've found, are pretty much on the level. I may not agree with everything they say, I might not agree with their techniques, but it doesn't mean their heart isn't in the right place. That's A. B, ultimately, and this is what I tell my students all the time, growing up is about not pointing the finger anymore. You can't, at a certain point, keep talking about your parents, keep talking about your lovers, keep talking about your ex, keep talking about your boss, keep talking about the other who has chained you. In the end, it's a short life. We're all going to die. It ends up being, what do I want to make? I see religious Judaism as a fantastic opportunity for soul making, for the creation of an authentic voice. And I think what Bill said is profoundly true, which is actually it's the multivalent voices in the tradition that give you permission to actually be able to forge out a truth that's your truth, and at the same time allow you to somehow coalesce with other people in the community. But is it an easy thing to do? No, it's a very hard thing to do.
It's really hard.
It's much easier just to succumb to the sort of status quo of Orthodox communities, or for that matter, the status quo of secular communities.
It's really hard because also there's this, I think, maybe this is just me, it's just this image of what the frum person should be like. And when you feel your distance from that, you're like, oh, what am I doing wrong? And I think that's what you have to just get out of your head, that version of the other also. And you can make yourself, especially now. Everything is so diffuse, Notwithstanding the screams that we're all, we all have to be like this. We're all so different. Even in the communities that claim to be so similar, there's just a difference all over the place. It's repressed, but it's there.
Any other questions?
Pardon?
Just to add, we're still rebels. About Tshuvah, you're still a rebel.
Always.
We try to be.
Always.
Yeah.
You always will be.
Which is
Yeah, go ahead.
the Orthodox world. But rebellion is not part of orthodoxy as we look at it now.
And there is such a trend over the last 20 years to do more, a fence around a fence around a fence, which kind of takes us away from what true religion should be and what true spirituality should be. It has become, I can do it, you're doing it, you're taking 20 minutes after Shabbat, I'm going to do 30 minutes after Shabbat, and that kind of thinking has just made it very difficult. Very difficult.
Right, but I'm urging not to let that be the
Yeah.
safety valve or the escape hatch where everybody says, oh, all these extremists, what this religion is for me. Orthodoxy, in a way, is a word that I wish, want to bracket, so bracket that. And let's think about Judaism, because Judaism was the original rebellion. The traditions of Bill alluded to before, the traditions, allusions to Abraham as this radical sort of monotheistic rebel are there to basically indicate to us that that's the path that we're going down. It's still true. Religion is countercultural at this point. It really is. Orthodox Judaism, religious Judaism is countercultural, not just in the world at large, but even within the Jewish community. It's the last sort of rebellion left. So I for all this talk about conformity, within Orthodoxy, religion is radical. That's what it is.
There was that the leadership doesn't deal with stuff. It says exactly the reverse.
Right.
It says be good and fit into the box and do whatever you want to do. I want to ask you a question related to this, and it's the question about commitment. There is on one side a tremendous need for commitment to live this kind of life. After all, it's not an easy life. but you're working at the same time on a certain level, on a certain base of insecurity about your own beliefs, right? Now the interesting thing is that the conservative movement, which we have seen in the late report, is more open to this, and it's even less commitment because of that. So in fact, it is breaking down, right? So what does that mean in terms of what this commitment should be? Can you have a commitment while there is insecurity?
Right, great question. I mean, that's the question that's being asked constantly now, as the literature all shows that fundamentalist movements have picked up more adherence, and liberal movements, both certainly in Protestant America, liberal movements that move towards liberalization and openness have hemorrhaged members, right? So it's bad news really for thinking people, right? I agree. On the other hand, what choice do you have? Right? Really, what choice do you have? You think how you think. You are who you are. So if you think in those kinds of terms, you've got to live those kinds of terms. I think what may have happened in conservative Judaism is that the notion of uncertainty became a religious principle. In other words, it became sanctified to be uncertain, as opposed for uncertainty being a consequence of struggle, which is what I think it should be, as opposed to putting it out forward as like, oh, we really don't know anything, so we don't have to do anything. You have to keep fighting to the end, I think. Yeah. Eugene, you wanted to ask something?
Yeah. Three of you came in Orthodoxy from the cold, as I did. I did it in the late 60s, early 70s, you were probably later. And Orthodoxy today is vastly different from the Orthodoxy that you entered in those eras. Orthodoxy today, my perception, is all about authority and community. When I say community, I'm not talking about the deep human bonds between people, but I'm talking about the conformity of the standards of the community. And it seems to me that Bill, you're not a Miltonian Orthodox person. I think you're a spiritual or religious person that has very little to do with orthodoxy as we experience it today. I mean, your hero is Rabbi Soloveitchik of the Halakhic Man. But Rabbi Soloveitchik would never, ever have moved to Bayit Pagan. No, that's not a joke. He chose to live out of the Orthodox community, the classic Orthodox community in Boston, because he couldn't handle the conformity of the Orthodox community.
Also not a normative figure, the Rav.
Right. So you can snuggle up, in spiritual comfort, and I can snuggle up in spiritual comfort with maybe the Guide for the Perplexed or the Halakhic Man. I don't know who Elliott snuggles up with, but I suspect, in terms of text, I'm talking about text, I suspect that these people are not the normative figures in Orthodoxy. Yeah. I mean, Soloveitchik was normative, but the normative text would have been his halakhic shiurim, not his philosophical text. Right. So I guess my question is, how do you negotiate all of this spiritual impulse and beautiful spiritual questing with the more pedestrian and prosaic aspects of Orthodoxy?
But do you see what's happened here, Eugene, is that we've become a mirror of the thing we don't like. So, we're all talking about this, and Nathan, you talk about this all the time. So, authority and conformity, and look what they're doing, and look what they're doing, and look what they're doing to Orthodoxy. So what ends up happening is you have people whose response to this is to complain about, look what they're doing, look what they're doing. So I don't care. In other words, it's one life, and it's short. So you have to go in the direction of where meaningfulness is going to take you. I mean, I have to say something. I find this discussion a little ironic. I look around this room. Who do I see in this room? I see Aviva Zornberg. I see Eugene Korn. I see Bill Kolbrener. I see Nathan Cardozo. I see fantastically talented people, all of whom have had an influence on my life for the good, right? All of whom made me think and made me strive and made me reflect. I don't care about the voices out there that are doing all that stuff. It's like somebody once said, they're just taking up rent-free space in your head. Yeah. Right? They are. We have to move past that, move past the authority and the sort of obsession with authority that's become the sort of complaint of all sort of progressive thinking Jews around the world who actually let those people get under their skin and into their head and have obsessed about them for going on, it must be like 25 years now, where all these conversations about these horrible Gedolim and horrible this and that. I'm not speaking to the truth or falsity of it. I'm speaking about the immense amount of time that gets spent thinking about these people and sort of plotting against them in your head and escaping from them in your head, and in the end, time passes, as Virginia Woolf would say.
I do not completely agree with you, Elliott.
I know you don't.
No, I think it is deeper than that. It is not so much to complain. It is to try to find the makor, to find the root of why this happened. Why is there suddenly all this conformity and this all one way going? I mean, as long as we don't understand the problem of why this happened, especially after the Shoah, because I think the Shoah has a lot to do with this, right? Suddenly the need to move this whole Yahadut in this direction, unless we recognize the problem from where that comes, we can't make the shift.
Do you honestly think we don't recognize the problem? You know, for 15 years, 20 years, people have been saying very sharp, incisive things about what the problem. People know what the problem is. It's not a question of knowledge. In life, there are all sorts of complex negotiations people make about the communities they live in and the lives they've chosen and the rebellions they can't risk because of their families or because of something else. So I don't think it just comes down to knowing. I agree with you that certain people don't know. But certain people really do know, and for whatever reason, they have to keep going on that route because there's too much at stake for them. And I'm not sure that knowing about it is going to change it. Maybe something else will change it, but I don't know that knowing is going to change it. Anyway, are there any other questions before we wrap? We haven't talked about drugs, right?
I never inhale. I never inhale.
You know, so that's fine. We lied. The title lied a bit. We lied. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.